Hi, I'm Dominique Luecke with Leader Ethics. We're delighted to bring you today's program, A Candid Conversation with Ron Kind, moderated by Rusty Cunningham. Ron Kind served as the Wisconsin 3rd District Representative to the U.S. Congress for 26 years, retiring from this position effective January 3rd, 2023. During his tenure in office, Congress faced numerous challenges. Today, we'll receive an enlightening inside view to some of these challenges, from the past, present, and the future. Of course, we couldn't be here today without the support of our sponsors. Special thanks to Festival Foods, Dave and Barb Scogan, Ann Bryce and Bill Haviland, Tom and Karen Houlihan, Joe and Pat Heim, and Leader Ethics. We would also like to recognize our program hosts who support this program via a live stream broadcast on Facebook. They are La Crosse Tribune, Chippewa Herald, Winona Daily News, the League of Women Voters of the La Crosse area, and Leader Ethics. To the members of our virtual audience, we ask that you please remain on mute. However, you will have an opportunity to submit questions via the chat function. And now leading off today's broadcast is Rusty Cunningham. Rusty is the highly respected and accomplished former executive editor of the La Crosse Tribune, Winona Daily News, and Chippewa Herald. Throughout his distinguished career, he has 40 years' experience in the newspaper industry, serving as a champion of integrity and community collaboration. It is my pleasure to introduce Rusty Cunningham.
Thanks so much, Dominique. It's an honor to see you today, Congressman. I'm looking forward to our chat.
Well, I'm glad to be here, and I want to thank Dominique for that great intro.
It's interesting to note that the 3rd is considered a swing district, and yet our House seat has been filled by only 3 people since 1975. When you were first elected in '96, you were only the 3rd Democrat to represent the district in the 20th century. And when you won your last race in 2020, you were one of only 7 Democrats nationally to win a House seat from a district that voted for Donald Trump. I have lots of questions that I want to get to, but first, I know that you want to share an overview and give us some of the highlights and things that are on your mind about the honor of serving our district for 26 years.
Well, I do, Rusty. It's great to see you and be with you again today, and thanks for this program. I think maintaining these conversations in our community is vital, to work through the issues that we have in God's country, a place where I was born and raised, where I chose to raise my family too with Tawny. And representing the 3rd Congressional District all this time was the honor of my life. It really was. If someone had told me as a kid growing up on the north side of La Crosse, the son of a telephone repairman, my mom working in the school district when she wasn't at home raising us kids, that I'd one day be serving in Congress, I would have thought they were crazy. I thought that was a place where only the Kennedys or the Rockefellers go, or those with great wealth or great political connections. That was not the kind family on the north side of La Crosse. So I guess I'm living proof that public service is still a calling that anyone can answer. And I believe it's a noble calling. As ugly and as poisonous politics has become lately, and as polarized and hyper-partisan as it's still important that we have the ability as a democracy to choose who our representatives are, work with them, give them feedback that we all need to make appropriate decisions, and make sure that this democracy is vital and healthy and growing and not in any great jeopardy. And we'll probably talk a little bit more about those trends during the program. But it was a great honor to serve what I think was the most beautiful congressional district in the nation. It was about 5 hours from north to south, and then going all the way over to Stevens Point, Wisconsin Rapids, and then bordering the beautiful Mississippi River. It was just a great district to represent because it was a classic swing district. It was about 50-50. Or more like 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 in registration between Republicans, Democrats, and Independents. And I love that makeup because it gave me room to maneuver and to be more independent in Congress because I knew I was there to serve the people back home. And I always remind my staff that if we weren't taking political incoming from the far left and the far right, we probably weren't representing the district very well because most of the people are pretty reasonable, they're pretty pragmatic, they're pretty much down the line and not part of the extreme fringes in politics today. And that's why it was so much fun and such a great honor to represent the area.
Our Leader Ethics group is founded on 4 principles. We think that ethical leaders should be honest and truthful, transparent with public information, a unifier rather than a divider, and committed to represent their entire constituency. Are those principles antiquated, or are those still things that we can expect of our elected leaders?
I think those are adequate standards, and public officials need to be held to high standards and not given any slack when they falter with that. Honesty, certainly. You have to be honest and upfront with the public, or they will stop trusting you. And when that day comes, they typically throw you out of office, or at least they should. And being transparent. I always enjoyed every year having public listening sessions in each of the counties that I represented, and did a lot of publicity beforehand to give people a chance to come out. And I would also do telephone town halls, knowing that people might be working or they might have a conflict the day I was in their community, yet they'd still want to hear from me or even ask questions. So out in my Washington office, I'd often have telephone town hall meetings, which was broader in scope and more people could participate, but they could still dial in and ask any question or raise any issue that they wanted. And maintaining that accessibility with the public you represent is essential for any democracy to flourish. But my concern is things have gotten so tribal that it's all about supporting your team that people are starting to overlook the flaws of the candidates that they're supporting. And that's dangerous because the standard is becoming lower and lower as far as the grievances that people might have with someone or the faults that someone might carry with them and their qualification to serve in office. And we're seeing that time and again with a variety of candidates. In fact, one new candidate in Congress appears to be just a perpetual liar. He's made up his entire life story. And now he thinks he deserves to be serving in Congress. That's problematic because he's going to find it hard now to work with his colleagues who are going to have a hard time trusting him because they won't know what to believe about him. And so much of a democracy being successful and an individual representative being successful is building that trust and that relationship, especially across the aisle. And in fact, it was one of my prouder accomplishments during the 26 years representing this district. I was always consistently ranked as one of the most bipartisan members, willing to reach across, find common ground with my colleagues. In fact, some of my closest friends, even today, are Republican colleagues who I served with in the House, and that's the way it should be. You could have honest differences of opinion on policy and have those great debates and, really get the lather up, but at the end of the day, you've got to remind ourselves we're all Americans, we're all in this together. And it's important that we find that area of compromise and common ground to get things done on behalf of the American people. And I'm afraid that that's being whittled away more and more each day.
You've talked about your proud upbringing as a proud Northsider. You're a good student, you're a good athlete, ended up studying at Harvard, playing football there. Between your junior and senior year, you interned for Wisconsin Democratic Senator William Proxmire. But even after that experience, you've said that politics wasn't really your chosen path. Now, as I understand it, you once lost a race for La Crosse School Board. So with that background, what convinced you to run for Congress in 1996?
I tell you, losing that school board race was probably the best thing for my political future. At least that's what Jimmy Carter felt, because he did the same thing. Because you're dealing with two of the most important issues in people's lives, their children and their pocketbook. And that's a tough job on the school board. And I admire those who are willing to serve on school boards here and throughout the country. It's very important. But, I went on to school in London. I studied there for a little bit. I had a chance to intern for a member of parliament. But even then, when I came back home, I didn't see that as a future path for me. Again, maybe it was the North Side image that people who are born and raised on the North Side of La Crosse just don't aspire to those higher offices. But eventually, I was able to return home in a prosecutorial role, met Tawny. The important lesson in life is to marry up, and I certainly did. And she's been a tremendous partner throughout all this. And while settling here after a couple of years, getting involved in some of the political stuff in the area, Steve Gunderson decided not to run. So it was an open seat, and a variety of people approached me as a potential candidate. And then Tony and I had to think long and hard about what direction our lives would take as a candidate and decided to throw our hat in the ring. And after a competitive 5-person primary, emerging from that and then going on to win the general election, I'm glad I've had that opportunity. And then facing that job review every 2 years after that first election, which is what you do in the House of Representatives.
So tell us what that first campaign cost in 1996 and compare it to what the last campaign cost in 2020.
Yeah, I tell you, it was a real shoestring operation the first time you run for office, especially if you can't independently finance, and we weren't in any position. I had to take a leave of absence from the DA's office while I was campaigning, so there wouldn't be any conflict issue there. And so I didn't have a paycheck coming in for the better part of a year. And then Tawny and I were pregnant for the first time during that first campaign year, too. And so when Johnny came, Tawny took maternity leave, so things were pretty thin. And you had to scrap for every nickel and every dime that you could raise to get your message out in the campaign. I think, we may have raised about $500,000, $600,000 total, which is a drop in the bucket in comparison to today's campaigns. And that was because you had a large district that you had to communicate in with multiple media markets. Fortunately, there weren't a New York, Chicago, or LA media market, which would be cost prohibitive. But nonetheless, running ads on TV is expensive. And it's one of the more effective ways of being able to communicate your message to the people. And that's why people wonder, why do you have to raise so much money in these campaigns? If you don't, it's hard for you to get your message out. And more importantly, the other side typically has these super PACs or independent expenditure groups that come in and carpet bomb you with a lot of negative attacks and negative ads. And if you're not in a position to respond to that, it's awfully hard to win an election.
So what did the 2020 campaign cost?
A little bit more. It was a competitive campaign, obviously. With Donald Trump being on the ballot again, there was a big turnout on both sides. But I think I was approaching north of $3 million, $3 to $3.5 million or so for that campaign. And a lot of it was media directed, but a lot of it too was having a good campaign staff that did a lot of the groundwork that helps, that grassroots organizing, which I think any successful campaign ultimately needs.
Money obviously is an important part of politics, whether it should be or not. What are the fundraising expectations of your party as a member of Congress? How much time did you have to spend at a phone bank each month? And what does a political donation buy for a donor, if anything?
First, let me preface my comment by saying that there's way too much wasted time spent on fundraising, and that happens on day one. But it really does depend on the district you're representing. Obviously, in light of gerrymandering, there are some really strong Republican districts, strong Democratic districts. Therefore, those candidates are keeping an eye on the primary, and that's where their main challenge might lie, is whoever emerges from that primary is generally going to win that general election, given the makeup of the district. But given that I represented one of the more swing districts in the nation, I had to keep an eye on both the primary and the general election. Right. But most of the times, the real contest was in the general race. And depending on the nature of the opposition and how strong the other side was going to go after me, that would kind of dictate the amount of money that I'd have to raise. So I did a lot of that at home here with just local fundraisers, birthdays and get-togethers, coffees, statewide too, since as a representative from Wisconsin, you do have a responsibility for the whole state, working with the rest of the delegation when issues come up that have a direct impact on Wisconsin. And then even partly on the national. Now, I never relied primarily on national fundraising. And I had a lot of small dollar contributors that I could rely on, which was nice. And I never forgot those people. Those who could send in maybe $5 or $10 in a campaign, I'll take it, because generally if they send you anything, chances are they're going to support you on election day. But the most fun I had with that was my annual corn roast that I'd have at the county fairgrounds. And it was polka music and bales of hay and brats and corn. It was just all things that makes Wisconsin great to raise a family and bringing people out. It was more of a festive occasion, and that helped with the final push of every campaign season.
You've talked a lot with pride about the fact that you've worked with members of both parties. And you've been considered quite moderate, and as you say, ratings have come to show that. But not every member of your party has been happy about that. Some wish you'd been more partisan, more liberal. Was that difficult to deal with?
No, again, it gets back to my previous comment. I was always reminding staff, don't worry if we're taking the severe criticism from the far left and the far right. That's not the district I represent. And staying true to that, knowing who the people are that you're representing, helped me throughout the years. And that came from getting out in the community and just listening to people. And I wasn't afraid to do that. And I was a pretty regular feature on the scene around here too. People could see me going to church or to ball games when my kids were playing, or to the grocery store. I was doing things that they all do, and they knew that I was approachable. They could come up and grab me and talk to me anytime they wanted. I like that. I fear some of the representatives now are becoming too isolated. They're not even doing listening sessions, let alone making themselves to the general public. And if you start losing that connection, you're not going to be a very good representative for them then at the end of the day. So I worked hard at it, and again, choosing to raise our family here made it easier to stay connected to the area. And Tony and I sure are glad we did, because raising a couple of kids in western Wisconsin, it's a tough place to beat, to do with a family.
It's a wonderful place, and again, great to represent. Now, you've also had some of your party members unhappy that you did not run for a higher office, for U.S. Senate or for governor. Were you ever close to making a decision to run for either one or any other higher office?
Yeah, when Jim Doyle decided to step down, I took a serious look at it then. But the kids were young, and it always became a trade-off, because I knew what a statewide campaign would entail. Constant travel throughout the state, constant fundraising,
Sure.
to get your message out. And I knew I would have to sacrifice 2 years out of my kids' childhood, because I'd just be campaigning and on the road all the time. There'd be certain things you could take the family to, but not on a regular or constant basis. And when you have them for such a short period of time already, that was a major deterrent to me running statewide, because even if I got elected, that responsibility would continue, representing the entire state and getting out and about. And that's how I would have wanted to be a representative, which would have meant more family time away. And I didn't want to do that and lose that opportunity to try to raise the kids the way we wanted to.
Exactly. You and I have the distinction, not a proud one necessarily, of being threatened by the same person along the way. And I have to ask, given the current political vitriol, have threats increased in recent years?
They did. Certainly during the Trump administration, I noticed more calls, more anger brewing then. It was pretty tough in 2010 with the rise of the Tea Party. I remember having listening sessions back then, and the auditoriums were full, and it was a lot of nasty comments. And they weren't there to be educated or to inform. They were there to create chaos and to get in my face. And we just couldn't allow them to dictate those terms. But it is problematic that now, especially with social media, it's so much easier to level these threats anonymously. And that's a problem, because without that, there's no accountability then. And we saw the manifestation of this happen on January 6th, unfortunately, the attack on our nation's capital. And it will be an infamous day in our history, just as December 7th was when we were attacked by Japan. And we ought not allow that to happen ever again. But I fear that the same ingredient that existed that gave rise to January 6th still persists today. I mean, the big lie about election fraud. There just is no evidence. There's no facts that back that up. And I think even President Trump realizes that, but he continues to play that card, and too many people believe it. And that creates a very dangerous situation where you could see a repeat of January 6th in this country, and that would be pretty tragic.
Was January 6th your worst day as a member of Congress?
Well, my worst day was whenever I got that call from the Pentagon that one of our fallen heroes had fallen in the line of duty. And I had 25 of them in this congressional district serving in Iraq or Afghanistan. Man, I hated that call, because I knew I'd have to get off the phone and then make that call to the family. And I hated making that call. And then going to the military funeral back home and seeing the tragedy, not just for the family, but the entire community. And I was so proud to represent a district that would embrace those families when they lost a loved one in the line of duty. It was so inspirational, but also heartbreaking that such a promising future was cut short in the service of our nation. Those were my worst days, and I would tell people that even today, the worst part of the job was seeing someone that you represented fall in the line of duty. But yeah, January 6th does rank up there pretty high, because I just couldn't imagine something like that would befold when it came to the peaceful transfer of power, which is the thing that truly does make America exceptional in the eyes of the world, where they look at us and they see us peacefully transfer power over and over again, given the nature of our democracy. And that was in jeopardy on January 6th. We ought not undercount that. It was in real jeopardy that day if we were not able to move forward with that electoral certification in Congress. After the states had already certified, it would have been a constitutional crisis. But fortunately, the crowd dispersed, and we immediately went back into session realizing how important it was to finish that job. And I remind my friends on the other side who believe in election fraud or whatever, you might be on the other side of that issue someday, so be careful what you're advocating or what you're talking about here, because that would not make us any better than any other third world nation that has a problem counting ballots.
Exactly. You've described as your worst decision the vote to authorize the use of force in Iraq. Looking back, did that decision have any impact on how you went about making decisions for future votes?
It really did, and it was my worst decision. Now, there were a lot of things that President Bush and his administration needed to do before they got to sending the troops in. And I felt my vote was important to put pressure on Saddam Hussein to get weapons inspection teams back in Iraq. And I didn't think we could do that without a credible threat of force hanging over his head. By passing that resolution, he did allow inspection teams in, but they weren't finding anything. And then that pit started growing in my stomach that, oh my God, this administration may be sending our troops in under bad information. And sure enough, there weren't weapons of mass destruction. In fact, I led in a letter before the president made the ultimate decision to send the 101st and the 82nd Airborne in to just allow the inspection teams to have more time to do their job, because they were already in country. They had access to all the sites. They weren't finding anything. And I had 160 of my colleagues sign that letter that we sent to the president. Well, obviously he ignored it. He ordered the inspection teams out, and he sent the U.S. military in, and the rest is history. And we now know that the reason and the justification for going to war didn't exist. And it has to be a last option for our democracy, because we see the toil of war and the loss of war and the tragedy of people losing their lives in the service of our country. And so, yeah, looking back and knowing how the administration was going to handle that authorization, I don't think I would have trusted them the way I did with that initial vote. But again, hindsight is usually 20/20, isn't it?
It is. So if the Iraq vote was your biggest mistake, what was your most significant accomplishment as a congressman?
It was also one of the more controversial pieces of legislation that I worked on, the Affordable Care Act, or as it became known, Obamacare. And, you know, it's awfully easy, I know, to scare people about their health care. And it was demonized, and it was distorted. There was a lot of misinformation about what that bill would do, talking about death panels and all that just didn't exist in the legislation.
And La Crosse was considered ground zero of the death panel debate.
Yeah, it was, and it was because of the wonderful program that they have on advanced directives. And all an advanced directive is for you to express your wish on what your end-of-life care should be, and everyone should have an advanced directive on their medical file. And Gunderson is one of the foremost leaders, not just nationwide, but throughout the world, where people are coming to try to duplicate the model that they created.
And Gunderson and Mayo worked collaboratively with preachers and attorneys and all sorts of folks to make sure that we are probably the highest percentage in the country of adults with an advanced directive.
Yeah, it's through the roof. I mean, I'm really proud of the fact that because of their outreach in the education program, most people around here have advanced directives on record. And it makes sense, because it's about empowering us as patients and what our care should be. And it gives direction then to our healthcare providers to what they can do or not do. Because one of the biggest problems we have in the healthcare system, Rusty, is overutilization. More tests, more procedures, regardless of results. That drives price up. And I was so proud to represent healthcare providers in this area that tried a different model, more coordination, more integration of care, not ordering that extra test if they didn't think it was necessary. And through that coordination, you end up with better outcomes. And so a large part of what I was working on in the Affordable Care Act is how do we duplicate the success that we saw at home here and take that nationwide? Better coordinated, integrated health care that would know what the best practices are for the best treatment options and get better results at a better price. That's really the essence of what the Affordable Care Act was trying to accomplish. And then creating alternative payment methods so that you reward good outcomes rather than more of everything. And that's really going to be the key to unlocking the expense of our healthcare system. And since the passage of that bill, we've been moving steadily in that direction. Over half of the Medicare payments today are based on value and quality, and no longer on the volume of service that is rendered. And that is saving us a lot of money. But healthcare expenses is one of the biggest cost drivers at the federal, state, and local level, certainly in our public budgets and also for most families and most businesses. So it's a huge issue. And we took a run at it in the Affordable Care Act, knowing it wasn't going to be perfect, knowing it was going to be controversial, but seeing the reaction that people had because we had the audacity of offering premium tax credits to lower income families so they can afford a quality health plan. I was surprised at that reaction, and it showed up all the time when I was having these listening sessions. But I'm glad it passed. I'm proud of the role that I played in it. There's still a lot more work that we have to do to improve and reform a healthcare system and make it more affordable. But a lot of that progress that we've made is directly a result of the Affordable Care Act and the fact that with President Obama's leadership, we were able to get it finalized.
And yet during that time, I recall that overwhelmingly you got two different responses when it came to what people thought about the legislation, right?
Well, I had a lot of phone calls coming into my office, and they were running 50-50 at the time, from no to hell no. It seemed like the only ones that were weighing in or calling were those who just, for whatever reason, were adamantly opposed to what we were working on. And I think part of that was just, it was a big bill, and there was a lot in it. And the irony in passing that bill, and we've seen this time and again, that if you pull the individual components of the legislation, it doesn't matter who you are, Republican, Democrat, Independent, there's wide support for it. But once you call it Obamacare, that's where the partisan divide is created, and that's when it becomes political. Because of all the patient protection things that we accomplished in the Affordable Care Act, where you can't get cut off because you have insurance or cancer, that there's no lifetime or annual payment caps with your insurance plan, those with pre-existing conditions are now protected with the health care that they have. The affordability with the exchange and the plans on the exchange and the tax credits that go for those who need help. It's all working. In fact, we've reached an enrollment record this year for signing up in the health insurance exchanges because of the affordability of the plans, coupled with the tax credits people apply for, and it's working. But at the time, it was big, it was complicated, and people weren't quite sure just what all it was going to do.
And it was easy in this area to take for granted the quality of health care, especially the integrated systems that we have. That's not the case elsewhere in many other parts of the country.
Yeah, and that's why I thought it was important to pass federal legislation so that we could tell the healthcare system writ large, no matter where you're practicing, this is the direction you need to go in. Better coordination, more integration, outcome-based care, rather than just racking up the bills with more tests, more procedures, regardless of results. And so we've seen a transformation of these other healthcare systems accordingly. We're not there yet, but it's certainly an improvement from where we came. Because I knew back then the status quo was disastrous. It was taking us to a bad place. Worse care, higher expenses, more uninsured. That was unsustainable. So just saying no was not an option. We had to do something to disrupt a system that was taking us to a bad place.
And as an example, people without insurance were using emergency rooms for often routine care. So it was the most expensive, and it caused healthcare systems to rack up larger and larger bills that they would write off to charity care, or may have an impact on the rates for people who did have insurance.
Yeah, and it was unfair to those healthcare providers to expect that they had to conduct triage on patients and expect that to be good enough, because you lack that coordination of care, the follow-up care that's essential, and that's why we wanted to have people work more closely with their family docs, their care practitioners who could act as a quarterback for their healthcare management. Because let's face it, as much as I've worked in the healthcare policy space, I'm not an expert on what I need. If I'm going to need a CT or an MRI, that's what we have to rely our experts to tell us. And it's all about data analytics now, being able to collect that data. And another large part of the Affordable Care Act is building out that health information technology system so we can finally start collecting the data and know what works and what doesn't work, and then drive that information into the hands of doctors and patients so they can make good decisions with it. That, in essence, was really the key to the Affordable Care Act, is knowing what works and then having the ability to collect that information and then getting it back into patients' and doctors' hands so they could make good decisions with it. It was about empowerment. It wasn't about a government-run, this is what we're going to tell you have to do. That couldn't be further from the truth.
I'm really struck by something you said a bit ago about part of your job was calling families after losing a loved one in a war zone. People think of the job of a congressman as being very glamorous. There's state dinners and there's junkets to other lands and all of this. But I also know there are some long hours, and I've been told even sleeping on the couch in your office doesn't sound terribly glamorous to me. Tell us about what your weekly schedule was like. When did you fly to Washington? When did you fly home? What impact did that have on not just you, but also your staff? And I'm thinking, too, one of your sons had a fight with cancer.
Yeah.
That had to be pretty difficult.
Well, to be honest, that was the other tough part of the job, is the amount of time you have to spend away from family, especially if you choose to live in the district, raise your family here. They can't come to Washington with you all the time. On rare occasions they would for special events, but that was difficult. But the job, what I liked most about it was the human connection that you get as a representative. I would oftentimes, and I did sleep on my couch when I was in D.C. because I didn't want to waste time commuting, having to go to an apartment or travel in the morning or later in the day. And quite frankly, the most peaceful time on Capitol Hill is later in the evening when staff has gone home, no more visitors. You just have the office to yourself. You can catch up on a lot of the work. And I would take that time as an opportunity to catch up on my emails coming in. And if there was a particular one I wanted to call, I'd pick up the phone and call that person that night. Say, hey, I got your email. I wanted to follow up with the question you had or what you just informed me about. And people were surprised that I'd be on the other line. You're out in Washington right now and you're calling me? But I enjoyed that because it made a special connection with people and they could hear directly from me then. And that was made easier by living in my office. But it's busy. I mean, we had 4-day weeks out in Washington when we were in session. So the first vote was typically be at 6:30 in the evening. Those are non-controversial votes, naming of post officers, that just to get people there and organized. So I'd fly out that day. Typically would have some meetings when I arrive. Sometimes the committees would start meeting right away. There would be committee meetings throughout the week. Obviously vote series with debates on the floor and votes that would take place. And then constituent meetings out in Washington throughout the day, throughout the week. So from the time I get up until I go to bed, it's pretty frantic. My schedule card typically had me booked at 3 places at the same time, and so you had to learn how to time manage and juggle a lot and know what the priorities need to be. But it was exciting, and I told people that if you like to learn something new every day, being a member of Congress is a tough place to be because of the issues you get to work on, the interesting people you get to meet at home and in Washington, and even worldwide sometimes. And it was like going to school.
And it's not exactly like when you came home for the weekend, you just sat at your house. You were pretty active in the community.
Yeah, and it's a big district, 19 counties, so something was always going on. I'd be on the road constantly for, again, listening sessions or meetings or businesses that wanted me to show up for a tour. I love the dairy breakfast time because you get to spend time on the dairy farms, meeting with these farm families. My respect and admiration for them is just through the roof, how difficult that occupation is, and yet vital for our food security system that we need as a nation. And this area, we had some great dairy families that just 24/7 would get the job done. But with fixed costs going up, labor issues that they have to contend with, healthcare costs that they have to worry about, it's because it's one of the more dangerous occupations. I was proud to be able to represent them, at least take their case to Congress so that their voices could be heard in the context of Farm Bill debates that would come up and all the other issues that affect rural America.
In a profile with the La Crosse Tribune before you left office, you said, quote, I wanted to treat the office with the respect and dignity that it deserved and be serious about it. and try to work with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, end quote. You've talked many times about that rising partisanship that sadly we've seen, and that it's made the job less fun for you. Are you worried about the future of democracy?
Well, I think seeing what we've seen transpire over the last few years, I don't know how you can't be a little worried about the direction we're going in. And now with the advent of social media too, and all the bad information that's available on the internet that inform people, that's problematic. I see too many of my colleagues coming to Washington with this my way or no way at all attitude, with no element of compromise, which is essential for the survival of any democracy. It just can't be your way all the time, or you're going to be very unsuccessful. It requires a lot of hard work, listening to colleagues that you want to team up with to advance legislation, and give and take. And that's the way to get things done. I only served in the majority 8 of my 26 years, so I had to get used to working in the minority. One of the little secrets that I learned is if I had a good idea and had a bill I wanted to advance, I'd seek out a Republican I could work with, and I'd put their name first. I'd put their name on top of the bill, because in the majority, they're going to be able to advance it with their leadership more than me in the minority. And it just worked well for me, and because of that, I didn't get all the credit, perhaps, but it's amazing what you can get accomplished if you aren't afraid of who gets the credit. And that's especially true in Congress. And so I'm advising new members, don't be afraid to spread that credit around and work hard to form those bipartisan friendships, which will make your life a lot easier.
Can you give us a couple examples where you helped pull together some legislation, put someone else's name from the majority on that? Yours is down the list, but you still feel really good about it.
Yeah, it's so important to support our rural hospitals. They're really in a tough bind given the revenue challenges they face, given the recruitment challenges they face. Getting someone to serve in a rural area is difficult. And so I often work with Kathy McMorris-Rogers. She's currently chair now of the Commerce Committee, one of the more powerful committees in Congress. But she and I co-chaired the Rural Health Care Caucus for many, many years together. She had a large rural district in Washington State. And I know there was a proposed funding cut for our critical access hospitals, which could have been the death knell for so many rural providers in our country, let alone in our district. And so I thought we need to plus up the reimbursement rate that would go to our rural hospitals. And Kathy, being co-chair with me on it, was the logical partner to team up with. And so I talked to her about it and said, put your name first because you're in the majority, and this will give us a better chance of trying to advance it. And so we did, and we were able to get this included in an appropriation bill, which was essential for the survival of our rural healthcare providers. Things like that, that if you don't worry about whose name goes first, there's a lot you can get done.
I've had the honor of working with your staff over the years for all those 26 years. And I know how you have emphasized having constituent services, doesn't matter what side of the aisle they're on. What are you proudest of when it comes to your staff and the things that they've helped people with over the years?
That's easy. When I'm walking around back home here in the district and someone comes up, hey, Ron, why don't I just thank you? Because I had a major Social Security problem or a veterans issue, and I gave your office a call, and before long, the problem was resolved. And I knew that was my staff picking that up, making the phone calls that had to be made, and then tracking that case so it didn't get filed off somewhere or lost somewhere, and just being tenacious as they were. And that was music to my ear. Nothing made me prouder than hearing those type of stories from the constituents and the impact it had on their lives. Because, a lost Social Security check or a missed Medicare reimbursement may not seem like a big issue for me, but for that person at that time, it was a huge issue in their life. And the fact that they could give my office a call and we could help them resolve it, very proud. And I've been very blessed throughout the years having such quality staff who are dedicated, and they knew that their boss were the people that we all represented. It wasn't me. It was making sure that they were doing right by the people back home. And I don't think they ever lost focus of that mission.
And some of those people have been with you from the beginning.
Yeah, some. Mark Allman up in Eau Claire from day one. Carrie Jacqueline, my district office manager, she's been with me almost the entire time. Janet, who handled all the immigration issues and tax issues, people that have issues with the IRS, was with me almost from the very beginning too. And I was blessed by having that expertise and institutional knowledge. There wasn't a lot of churn, so there wasn't a lot of starting all over again and training people up. Now in Washington, there's a little more churn because there's just more opportunities for people to advance out there, whether it's in federal agencies or even in the private sector. But even during that time, I was proud that the bulk of my staff were from Wisconsin, typically from the congressional district, so they already had a working knowledge of who we were representing and the issues that were big in our district.
And you had people like Lauren Cannonberg, who I believe was there from the very first, well-known in the community, respected in the community. People were comfortable going to him, and as you say, if there's a problem with a Medicare check or a Social Security check, they don't really care what party you're part of. They want help.
Yeah, and I think sometimes people overlook that fact that a congressional office isn't just a member on the House floor screaming at the other side and voting on bills, but it's a large part of it is constituent service and the casework that comes before us in helping resolve those issues. And I especially found great joy in helping veterans when they were having some problems, because that's a promise that we have to keep, and making sure that they're being taken care of, both physically and mentally, when they do return home from their service. And in light of Iraq, Afghanistan, we've had 2 million veterans coming home from those deployments with certain physical and mental needs that have to be addressed. And we had a little issue with the Toma VA a while back where there was an overprescription of pain medication that got out of hand. But I thought we handled it appropriately by bringing the investigators in to get to the bottom of it, and that then led to the Jason Simkowski Promise Act, which reformed the way we treated the management of pain for our veterans. So it wasn't just a cocktail of prescription drugs and opioids that we just load up on these veterans and hope that solves the problem. That's just treating the symptom, not the cause of what they're going through. And now, because of what we learned from the problems at Toma, we have a much better comprehensive integrated type of health care plan for each veteran that goes in. It's a comprehensive health system and less emphasis on pain medication and more on alternative treatments of care that can address the same issue. And I always felt that if we could do this the right way in Toma, that could be the model of care throughout the nation. And it really is becoming that model of care throughout the entire VA system.
I'm sure there are things you miss about Washington. I think, though, I know one you don't, and that is the recent vote for Speaker of the House. 15 different votes, as you know, roll call, calling every name, to decide on Kevin McCarthy. I know you once, I think just once, voted against Nancy Pelosi for the Speaker position. Give us an idea of the kind of fallout that you had and the kind of fallout that may or may not have come to our district.
Well, I did, and it was more than once, I believe, when I voted against Speaker Pelosi, because I felt we were in need of a generational change. I mean, as hard as our leadership at the time was working, from Speaker Pelosi to Steny Hoyer, Jim Clyburn, the big three, they were all approaching 80 years old. And I always felt that you need to keep the blood circulating in Congress and those fresh ideas coming forward in that. And that's why I was looking for different leadership. And not just on our side, on both sides, that we were in desperate need of new leadership because of how toxic the leadership became with each other. They couldn't even be in the same room talking to each other, and that's not good for a democracy. The leaders at least need to be able to talk and coordinate and figure out, all right, what can we do here working together? What's beyond the reach, so we know that too. And so we did need that change. But I was so glad I wasn't on the House floor that week. I would have been so impatient with 15 roll call votes. The fact that a small group on the Republican side could hold the United States Congress hostage for as long as they did, and I hope the lesson that they didn't learn from that is they can do that anytime they want. And I'm worried that Speaker McCarthy may have given the House away with the rules changes that he succumbed to with their demands. Now, one person can bring a motion to vacate the speakership anytime they want, which would just bring everything to a screeching halt. And there may be instances when the Congress needs to act a little quicker to get things done so that we don't have a government shutdown. We don't have a default on our financial obligations for the first time. And this group now may realize that they have the power to just paralyze and shut everything down, and the bad consequences that will flow from that. I mean, only time will tell, but it was tragic that we had to witness that, because the first rule of a majority is you have to elect a speaker, and it's someone that you have to choose. And they failed to do that 14 times that week until finally a deal was cut, and Kevin McCarthy was elected. But I fear that he's going to be a very weak speaker now because of that episode.
Speaker Pelosi was known for being pretty tough. Was she tough on you after your vote?
No, she really wasn't. She had no. I always had a good, working, respectful relationship with her and her with me, and I think part of that was I was upfront with her all the time. If I couldn't be there for something, I would let her know and explain why. And it was typically because it wasn't in the best interest of the district I was representing, and I would explain it, and she got that. And she knew I wasn't playing politics with it. So because of that, I think there was mutual respect, and there was no consequences to me voting against her for Speaker or perhaps on a bill that I may have opposed her on in the past. I had to be, and I always was respectful of Second Amendment rights given the nature of the district and the number of gun holders that we have back home. I love to hunt myself. I own multiple guns. So there were certain gun safety proposals coming from the Democratic Party, which I felt may have been a step too far, and it wasn't necessary, and I'd let them know. But she felt passionately about more gun control, gun safety measures that needed to take place. So I always thought that as long as you can communicate and be upfront, and again, back to transparency, right, you can avoid a lot of problems.
Is that one of the issues that Democrats have not done a good job at connecting with rural Americans, gun control?
Even rural Americans don't want to see the mass shootings that are taking place, and there's no easy answer to any of this. And a lot of them do favor comprehensive background checks. I know, because they're my neighbors, and they're hunting buddies of mine, too. They also feel strongly in Second Amendment rights. But there are areas of some practical steps that we can and should be taken. The red flag law, so that a proper judge can issue an order preventing someone that might harm themselves or someone else and take the guns away. And as long as it's a judicial determination, there's no violation of the Second Amendment. Due process is respected for that. So I think there's a lot of common ground that can be had here on that topic especially, but given how extreme both sides have come on the issue, it makes that area of compromise that much more difficult to achieve. This week in particular, we're seeing story after story of the gun violence in our country. And let's not fool ourselves. We are unique in the world for that because of the gun culture that we have. But if anyone thinks there's a simple solution to it, they're mistaken. I don't subscribe to the viewpoint this is all about mental health issues. It's more complicated than that. Yes, we need to be doing a better job helping people with mental illness in our country, but given the easy access of guns, that's also a common denominator with all this.
The afternoon that you announced that you are not going to seek re-election, you pulled together a group at a downtown eatery. There's about a dozen people, friends and supporters, and even one journalist. You seem surprisingly at peace with your decision. Why?
Well, it's not a decision you make overnight. It's something that you build up to. And obviously having a lot of conversations with Tawny and the family, because they were all in with this as well. And you just reached a point, I reached a point, at least in my career, where I felt it was the right time. 26 years is a long time to be running back and forth to Washington, and given the responsibilities of the office too, and making sure that you are available and accessible to people back home, which means on the road constantly, visiting those 19 counties constantly. And you just start to run out of gas, and it just wears you down a little bit, and it's right and proper to turn it over to someone else. And that's one of the enduring factors of our democracies. We are all replaceable from the president on down, and that's what keeps it going. You just hope that who comes next is going to be as diligent and as respectful to the office as I tried to be, and that's all that you can ask for in your representative, and that they will listen to their constituents and make sure that they're accessible to their constituents, so that they hear what they want to, and especially what they don't want to hear from time to time.
And as you've said, there's a report card every 2 years. So serving constituents, trying to represent the district in all sorts of ways, obviously is a critical factor in not relaxing.
Yeah, it is. And again, I would go around the block with some of my own party members who felt, well, I should be a little more strident, a little more partisan, level those zingers a little bit more. But, that was never really part of my DNA. Maybe it was the middle child in me that came out, where I had to try to find compromise with my older and younger siblings and that. But I just felt to be more effective you had to be serious, and you had to be viewed as a serious legislator and someone that people can trust and that they felt they could work with, even if you're a member of the other party. And I demonstrated that throughout my 26 years, and proud of those rankings of bipartisanship. And because of that, there were also other rankings showing I was one of the more effective members of Congress with the bills I was able to advance, because even though my name may have been second on the list, I still got some credit for legislation that my name was on. And I just hope and pray that future members of Congress will try to abide by that and try to get things done rather than score cheap political points all the time.
We have some questions in the chat room, and I'm going to get them to them in a moment. But one of the questions I see is exactly the one I had as my last question. And that is, have you made a decision on your next career step? And is another run for political office possible?
Well, I'm not one that likes to never say never, but it would take a lot for me, I think, to get back in after the honor of 26 years serving in Congress and the people I got to represent. I have been in some conversations with the White House about some tasks that they may need some help on. I was recently in the running to be a special envoy to Northern Ireland, but the president chose a Kennedy over a Kind. I guess he wanted style over substance, and he went with Joe Kennedy, who happens to be a dear friend of mine, and he'll be a rock star, as you can imagine, in Ireland. But it's a very serious issue that I've been working on that needs resolution, and that is a result of Brexit and how Northern Ireland will be treated economically. And we're trying to avoid a trade war between the UK and the European Union, two of our closest allies, especially with Ukraine going on, and the need for all of our allies to be on the same page and standing up against Putin and his unlawful aggression there. So that's an issue that needs to be resolved. I've been in conversations with Joe about that and the various personalities that are involved in resolving that dispute. That would have been a fun gig that I would have enjoyed, but I mean, we'll see.
I'm sure you'll tell the Lacrosse Tribune first when it comes time to.
Right.
One of our questioners asked, given the makeup of the House, will there be meaningful legislation that clears both the House and the Senate in 23-24?
I'm doubtful, mainly because of the episode we saw in the first week and how difficult it was for them even to choose their own speaker. And now for them to develop consensus as a party on what they want to move legislatively, I think will be hard. It's going to be hard to unite that caucus, I feel, given the extreme wings that exist there. The one thing that does unite them is their disdain for the current Biden administration, so I would expect numerous investigations, endless oversight hearings, delving into every topic under the sun. That's something that they can focus on, and they will undoubtedly focus on. Hey, listen, I'm all for oversight. I'm all for holding the executive branch accountable, because as a co-equal branch, it's part of our responsibility. But if they're just doing it to score cheap political points, that may wear a little thin with the American public, given the serious issues that we're facing right now. And we'll just see how that plays out.
Another of our questioners asks, as a member of Ways and Means Committee, were you able to get legislation that helped farmers and the agriculture community?
Yeah, we were able to. One bill that I was able to, one of the last bills I got accomplished was some production tax credits for methane digesters, which is a way for our dairy farmers especially to better manage waste management, convert it into energy. And the technology is becoming better, so you don't have to be a 5,000 head dairy herd in order to take advantage of these methane digesters. Even smaller ones can start setting those up, and that's it's a win-win-win, from manure management to conversion to energy, a renewable source. And Dairyland was already teaming up with it. Gunderson was, Organic Valley. They're all looking at this right now.
And it's interesting you mentioned our area is known for being innovative. What Gunderson has done in particular with bringing in wood chips, just one of many examples. So that has to be pretty heartening that you can go to Washington and talk about some of the cool things going on in your district.
It really is. And a great story I love to talk about is Cashton, of all places, small rural community in the heart of my district. You know, they've done geothermal downtown with most of the businesses. They've got a solar farm now. They're teaming up with Excel. They have Organic Valley and the windmills there too generating, and they're just generating all this renewable energy. Folks, if we can do it in Cashton, Wisconsin, we can do it anywhere. and they're showing the way to get this done. So, and it makes economic sense. I mean, even getting outside the whole debate about climate change and the controversy that might generate, it just makes good economic business sense to be investing in these renewable energy sources. And it is healthier for us and the air quality that we're all breathing. And I think it's one of the reasons why Gunderson and the Mayos and those healthcare providers found it in their interest, too, to promote sustainable, renewable energy. And the fact that Gunderson now is the first major healthcare provider that went to zero carbon footprint, they've showed the model of how it can be done. And I was one of the advocates on Ways and Means of promoting that and creating incentives for more big healthcare providers to do the same thing. And we just sent out a survey at the end of last year to all the healthcare providers, asking them to report back what steps are they taking and what policy-wise they could use to expedite all of this. And of course, Gunderson was at the center of all of it.
Yeah, it's just cool to sit back and look at some of the innovation, as you say, places like Cashion. If Cashion can do it, we ought to be able to figure this out nationally. Yeah. Another questioner asks, what do you foresee for the 2024 election?
Well, obviously, all eyes on Joe Biden and what decision he makes. I will say this, though. I was incredibly surprised how successful his first 2 years went legislatively and what we were able to accomplish legislatively. From the bipartisan infrastructure bill, for decades we've been talking about the need to upgrade our infrastructure, our roads, our highways, our bridges, our airports, our ports. Never could get there because the pay-fors was always too difficult. And maybe this was the skill Joe Biden brings to his position now, his familiarity with how Congress works, his relationship with the Senate, but he was able to cobble together that bipartisan coalition to finally get it done. And now we're starting to see these projects moving forward. You can't have a sustainable economic growth without a sustainable infrastructure underneath it all. That's going to make it easy for people to get from point A to point B or to transport the goods and products. A large part of that bill was focused on supply chain disruption, which is one of the causes for the inflation that we're seeing today. The American Rescue Plan, we're still seeing those dollars and the positive impact it's having back home, including language I got in to deal with PFAS contamination. That is an allowable use of that rescue plan funding in order to help with testing and remediation steps to deal with PFAS, a growing problem not just in our own backyard here, but throughout the country. The CHIPS Act, so that we can do a better job of manufacturing our own microchips here in this country, given that the entire global economy is driven by these chips and microprocessors today. We can't become dependent on other nations for that vital supply, as Russia's finding out, given the economic sanctions that we're hitting them with and cutting off all this high tech that they normally get. That would support their army or their economy. They're in a world of hurt because of these economic sanctions that Putin has caused. So those type of things that we were able to accomplish, including the toxic burn pit legislation for our veterans that were exposed to these burn pits. And this was something that was especially near and dear to President Biden because all evidence points to Bo contracting cancer from the burn pits that he was exposed to during his service in Iraq. So the president cared deeply about getting that done. So for the first 2 years, it was a remarkable list of accomplishments. And it'll be interesting to see what he's able to do these next 2 years. My guess is because of legislative gridlock, especially in the House, he's going to be more foreign policy focused, more national security issues, hopefully more trade, which I feel we need to get in the game again. We've got to be one of the leaders in promoting a rules-based global trading system with our values, elevating worker standards, elevating environmental standards, a better job of protecting our intellectual property, and having a good dispute resolution process and enforcement mechanism. So if your trading partners aren't living up to it, we have ways of enforcing it. That's a lot better than trade wars, and because that can lead to recessions and even depressions, as we saw back in the 1930s.
Is there reason for hope for Ukraine?
I think there is, because of the fighting spirit with the Ukrainian people. They are unbelievable, and no one really saw that coming. And they're not blinking, but they do need our support. And I'm glad, again, grateful for the leadership that President Biden's been able to bringing NATO together literally overnight, bringing the free world together overnight in support of Ukraine, and the economic sanctions regime that he was able to accomplish. I was very much involved in the high-tech sanctions export of that, working with our EU and UK allies, co-chairing the UK caucus, making sure that We were all on the same page. There was no daylight separating us, no exemptions being given. And I do feel it's having a huge impact on Russia's military capability, but also their economy. And it was because Joe Biden believes in allies, he believes in alliances, he believes in NATO, and this is proving to be incredibly valuable at a moment like this when we see war in Europe in the 21st century again.
Exactly. I'm going to wrap up here and turn things over, but I have to make mention of the letter to the editor, and so it ends. After nearly 26 years, the liberal love affair between Congressman Ron Kind and the La Crosse Tribune will soon end. Well, I don't know that we've necessarily had a love affair, but we've certainly had a lot of respect, and I appreciate all that you've done through your service and the way you've served our district. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Rusty. It's been an honor.
With that, let's turn it over to the founder of Leader Ethics and the executive director, Lee Rosh.
Well, we want to thank you, Ron and Rusty, for an informative and very engaging conversation. And Ron, in particular, we wish you the very best in this next phase in your journey. The next Leader Ethics program is going to be part of the community collaboration. This collaborative includes WXOW, WKBT, WIZM, the La Crosse Tribune, Wisconsin Public Radio, and Great Rivers United Way. The program topic will be public education in La Crosse, enrollment trends, and community relations. The program itself is in development, so we encourage you to go to the website leaderethics.us to get updated information. To all, thank you for participating in today's program, and have a wonderful day.